An ethics committee is actually as good as the members, and we must understand what are the roles and responsibilities of each of these members, and that is what we are going to do in this module. The objectives that we have is primarily to understand individual roles and responsibilities. Before we know the roles, we should find out how do we select a good person to be a person appropriate to be a member. It has to be understood that members are selected based on their personal capacities, depending on their qualifications, their experience, their interest. I think this is probably far more crucial than any of the above. The commitment. Do you have the time to come for the meetings? Do you have the time to review the protocols? Because every committee's performance is as good as the performance of individual members and their commitment and their contributions. Obviously, they will be appointed to the committee for that role. For example, if the lawyer is appointed in the committee, he will perform the work of the lawyer, even if he has a medical degree or he has a science degree. Whatever degree he may have other than his law degree, if he is appointed as a lawyer, that is the role that he will have to play. Obviously, what is the role and responsibility of the ethics committee and therefore individual members is to protect the dignity, rights, safety and well-being, and this can be said 100 times and still not be adequate, because that is finally the bottom line. And of course, apart from that, the ethics committee members also have to ensure ethical conduct of research by the investigator team, which is the continuous monitoring that they will do. In order to do this, we have to declare conflicts of interest. This cannot be repeated enough times, because conflicts of interest are hidden sometimes, and it is the responsibility of the member to declare these conflicts of interest. The ones that are very obvious are the ones that occur because you are an institutional member, and maybe you or your spouse or some child may be part of the protocol and you are a member of the committee. That is a conflict of interest. You will have to address that. You will have to express that so that the committee can address it. The major role, how do you ensure safety and safety of the participant and safeguarding their rights, is by doing competent initial and continuing review of scientific, ethical, medical and social aspects of the research proposals in an objective manner, timely manner. That means if you do not do it within the time frame, it's a reasonable time frame. Once a month is usually a good enough. If you need to meet more often, you might consider having more ethics committees instead. And independent manner, by attending meetings, participating in the discussions and the deliberations. This is the role of every member. And every member must ensure that ethical values are maintained. International scientific, apart from our own ICMR guidelines, even international scientific standards have to be maintained. Individual studies may have their own requirements in terms of who the sponsor is, and if there are international collaborative studies, then there are other issues that have to be looked at. Apart from that, it is expected that the EC also assists in the development and education of the research community. And for that, the ethics committee needs to take on training roles. We have to train investigators to understand and appreciate what are these ethical issues so that they are able to apply them. Of course, the EC has to function according to SOPs, and this will never be said enough times. Last but not the least, it is the role of the EC to ensure the privacy of the individual and confidentiality of all the data, and also including the documents of the EC meetings, etc. Let us now look at individual members. So if the person is a chair, whoever is appointed as a chair must be non-affiliated. This is a non-negotiable requirement because we need independence. And it is usually a well-respected person from any background, but with prior experience, having served or has served in ethics committee. That is what the institutional head usually looks at when he or she appoints a chairperson or a person to be called vice chair if your SOP requires that. Remember that this chairperson may serve the role of a lawyer or a social scientist depending on their basic qualification. What does the chairman have to do? The chairman has to ensure independence and efficiency. In fact, the chairman is responsible for the committee's functioning. He or she has to conduct the EC meetings, and this is probably the most crucial role that the chair plays. And it is very important that he ensures active participation, ensures the group dynamics of that group of unknown people who may not know each other, and especially the non-affiliated, non-medical people, the non-technical individuals are often diffident, are often not really ready to participate in discussions, and it is up to the chair to bring them out, to get them to participate and ask their opinions and encourage them in understanding some of these medical terms. Seeking the conflict of interest declaration is also the responsibility of the chair, along with the secretariat, of course, and the chair also ensures that the quorum is met, whatever the quorum is decided, and that the decision making is fair. The chairman may or may not be given veto powers. That again depends on the SOP, but this has to be used carefully, and the final decision has to be a fair decision for the proposal and with the participant at the center. The chairperson also ratifies the minutes of the previous meetings. The chairperson is responsible to handle complaints against not only researchers, and there are many, mind you, especially in large institutions. There may be publication issues, there may be queries coming from journals. The chairperson has to make sure that this is handled correctly. EC members, if there are complaints against EC members, conflict of interest issues, and requests for the use of data from the ethics committee also have to be handled. Expedited reviews are also looked at in some ethics committees depending upon the SOPs by the chairperson. Of course, if the chairperson is expected to be absent, either the known vice chairperson who is already appointed, or the members may nominate an acting chairperson. All this, whatever it is, has to be written down in your SOP, and you have to act according to that. What about the member secretary? Now, the member secretary is affiliated, is always a member of the institution because they have maximum responsibility, especially of the data and archival and communication. Of course, this person should have knowledge and experience in clinical research and ethics. This is important, sometimes difficult to get, but you need that at the beginning. I'm afraid the be motivated is again as important as it is to be a member, but for the member secretary, be motivated is important because a non-motivated person cannot make the committee do well. They have to have excellent communication skills. I'm afraid they are at the shooting end for all investigators who have them as the target because they are the ones they communicate to. And although they are the ones communicating a decision of the whole board, it is they who are talking and therefore are targets sometimes. So they have to have not only just good communication skills, but also good tolerance skills so that they are able to take and deal with aggressive investigators at times. Of course, they should be able to devote time, which, as I have said some time before, that this needs to be protected by the institution. The member secretary has to organize effective, efficient procedures for receiving and processing the applications, schedule ethics committee, get to the administrative aspects of the ethics committee. That is the role of the member secretary. Make sure that the documentation is good. Make sure that the EC members are trained as well as the EC secretariat is trained so that they work according to SOPs. Make sure that the SOPs are updated, especially with changing laws. We've been having to change SOPs almost every month because the laws are changing that often. New guidelines are getting published. So your SOPs, and this is the role of the member secretary, and then ensure that the EC functions according to these SOPs. The ethics committee secretary also has to ensure adherence to SOPs. prepare and respond to audits and inspections. Nowadays, there are a lot of people who come to audit and inspect ethics committees, and we are expecting more from the CDSCO, because, especially for regulatory studies, possibly even from ICMR. We don't know how things will move in future, but there are likely to be good number of audits and inspections, and we must prepare for it, and this is the role of the ethics committee. Completeness of documentation is very important. Having a good agenda drawn for the meeting, then assess the need for expedited review, exempt from review or full review, whatever it is that the investigator may have submitted. It is the member secretary's role to ensure that falls into the correct place depending on how it is described into the in the SOP. The correct silo has to be chosen. If expedited review, then the expedited review process has to be done. Do we need other scientific review? Do we need to send it out to the expert panel? Do we need to invite? The member secretary has to take some of these decisions, and often these decisions can be taken in conjunction with or in consultation with the chairman. The member secretary also has to make a lot of phone calls and ensure that the quorum is being met, otherwise that meeting will become invalid. The basic medical scientist is the third person, who may be affiliated or non-affiliated, but who has to be a non-medical person or a medical person with a qualification in basic medical sciences. This is a recommendation not often written in many guidelines, but except that CDSCO mentions that preferably a pharmacologist in their basic medical scientist, because they are reviewing regulatory drug trials. And therefore, it is important that if you are reviewing clinical trials with drugs, it is preferable to have a pharmacologist, a medical pharmacologist as your member. What work do? They essentially help in the scientific and ethical review. Scientific more than the ethical. They have to focus on what is the intervention, what is the benefit risk analysis, is the research design appropriate. Yes, we agree that all of the science will have been looked at and the expert will be the investigator, but this basic medical scientist needs to look at this as well. Methodology, is the statistics all right, and therefore the training for this basic medical scientist or pharmacologist, whoever the case may be, has to be good and has to be technical. Of course, in the continuing review process, the basic medical scientist also needs to assess whether there are any changes in the risks and the benefits, because if so, then the EC may have to change their decisions. They also take a very important role in reviewing serious adverse events, protocol deviations and their impact on patients, and continuing the study, on progress and completion reports, and so on. So these are some of the things that the basic scientist does. What about the clinician? The clinician can also be affiliated or non-affiliated. Remember, affiliated individuals are likely to have conflicts of interest, are likely to have their own projects in the pipeline, etc. However, it doesn't mean that you can't have, and you have to have some number of affiliated individuals as well. So it would become, as we know, 50% should be affiliated and 50% should be non-affiliated members for all of them. And they would be members with recognized medical qualifications, expertise and training. The regulatory studies, the CDSCO demands that the Schedule Y says that the person who is serving as a clinician should have a postgraduate medical degree. A non-postgraduate degree holder cannot do this. And the clinician does both initial review, ongoing review, and especially looks at the medical care, especially in terms of when before starting, is the PI adequately trained, is the facility adequate, is there provision for medical care in case of SAEs. The clinician is also expected to look at the intervention just like the basic medical scientist will, but this would be from a clinical point of view, look at some of the science, research, design, etc. And during the ongoing review, the SAE review, the serious adverse event review, is very crucial by this clinician, especially in terms of agreeing or disagreeing with the principal investigator about the causality or the relatedness and the extent of the risk factor. All these are relevant for regulatory studies, protocol deviations, progress reports, etc. also seen. Now, the legal expert also can be affiliated or non-affiliated, but has to have a basic degree in law and has to have some experience, and preferably the experience can be in medical law. The regulatory ethics committee, or the ethics committees which review regulatory studies usually require that this person with the law degree should not have or should not be a practicing medical doctor as well. So, they have to be affiliated to whichever of the councils, either the law or the medical council. One of the two has to be given up. That is, the medical has to be, if they have to be a legal person. Now, the legal person has to look at, apart from the ethical and review of the proposal and ICD, it is absolutely crucial that the legal person looks at all the legal documents that are associated with clinical studies. For example, the MOU, the clinical trial agreement, and this is even more so if the legal department in the institution does not support. Otherwise, they will go through these MOUs and CTAs. If they do not, or even if they do, the lawyer in the ethics committee has to look at it. Look at the regulatory approval, look at the insurance documentation, the researcher's undertaking, protocol specifics, permissions, so on and so forth, including HMSC approval for international collaborative studies. And also important, just like the member secretary, the legal expert has to interpret and inform EC members about new regulations, if any, and these have been happening quite a lot recently. The social scientist, philosopher, ethicist, theologian could also be affiliated or non-affiliated and should have an individual appropriate qualification in or training and or experience in that particular field that they come from. And more important, they should look at and be able to review and therefore be sensitive to local cultures and moral values of that area, of the region from where the patients come from. And a social scientist could be, or a philosopher, ethicist, theologian could be from an NGO who is associated with healthcare research. They have to review the protocol, ICD along with translations, but more importantly, they have to assess the impact on community and the involvement of community, the socio-cultural context, the religious, philosophical context, if any. And these are many which perhaps people may not, scientists will not be able to assess or review or understand, and bring in ethical and societal concerns. The layperson is always the most central, because the layperson represents the patient on whom the research is going to be done. Always has to be, like the chairperson, non-affiliated. You can't have one or the other. Layperson has to be non-affiliated. And importantly, the person should be literate, obviously in the English language, because all the proposals are in the English language. But this person also has to be able to read at least a translation, because the translated words, so he has to be a representative of the community. Should not have pursued a medical science or health related career in the last 5 years. This is what the ICMR guidelines say, and this is what you have to understand, because so if you've done a BSc a long time ago, it doesn't mean that you can't serve on an ethics committee as per the ICMR guidelines. This the regulatory studies have different connotations sometimes. Maybe a representative of the community, for example, you may have a person, as I said before, a cancer survivor, if it is an oncology study, or a person with HIV could be on they would be expected to understand how a patient who is going to be in the study will feel about the protocol, and therefore will be able to contribute best. Importantly, they should be aware of the local language. They should be aware of the cultural and moral values about what is induced, what will be undue inducement. Will the patient feel that this is too much? Will they expect more? Will we, is that protocol short charging the patients? Can some protections be put into place? All this should be looked at by the lay person. So they do an ethical review, Most important is of the ICDs along with the translations, and they have to look from the patient's point of view, the benefits and risks. This is so important that you have to understand that perception of risks or benefits are completely different depending on the stakeholder that you are. If you are a patient, you will have a completely different perception of what is the risk in the study, and that is what we expect this layperson to bring to the table in that ethics committee discussion, not a technical review. It is not expected from a technical person. Serve as a patient participant community representative, therefore, and assess social impacts, if any. The new ICMR guidelines specify that you have to have a minimum of 5 members as your quorum, but this has to be defined. Whatsoever you decide, this has to be defined. The CDSCO has clearly in Schedule Y defined its quorum. So if you're doing regulatory studies, definitely go to that and you must follow that because that's the law. But what ICMR says is you must have a mix and match of technical, non-technical members, affiliated, non-affiliated members, but you must have minimum 1 non-affiliated members, and preferably the layperson. Remember, the layperson is non-affiliated. The layperson should be part of the quorum. As I said, regulatory trials must be as per CDSCO rules, and no decision. That means that whole meeting would become invalid unless you fulfill the quorum. Thank you.